Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi said at the United Nations General Assembly that China has significantly reduced poverty, improved the health of the people, and pushed for green development as the country works steadily to achieve its United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. He also made a keynote speech at the dinner emphasizing the mutually beneficial cooperation is the only option for China and the United States, and neither country has taken advantage of the other. So what is China's contribution to the 2030 agenda for sustainable development, and where are China-U.S. trade tensions headed? What are the other hot topics coming out of the 74th session of the UN General Assembly? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Su Ge, Chairman of the China-Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, and Rick Dunham, visiting scholar from Tsinghua University. We'll also speak via satellite to Mark Sleboda, a Moscow-based international affairs and security analyst, and Isabel Hilton, CEO and editor of ChinaDialogue.net in London. That's our topic. This is a Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, gentlemen. I'm a little bit surprised that President Xi Jinping failed to show up at the UN General Assembly. However, State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi did give a speech. What do you think of the major points that he delivered to the attendees?
Well, although our president didn't go there, he has authorized State Councilor Wang Yi to be his special envoy. And then the foreign minister there. Because this time the United Nations Special Conference, special session, is on sustainable development, on climate change and green development and so on. Minister Wang Yi this time, with his speech is rather short compared with his normal attendances to the United Nations, but with eloquent figures to show that China, as a responsible member of the international community, as a member of the renowned world organization as the United Nations, has fulfilled, actually 10 years ahead of time, China has fulfilled the agenda regarding poverty elevation, and according to by the United Nations development plan for 2030. So that's quite remarkable. And also from the speech can show that Wang Yi, and he's showing to the international community China is ready and to go on the road to be open to the outside world, to cooperate with other nations for win-win results, and also Minister Wang Yi said all these things with good confidence.
Rick, do you think our State Councilor and Foreign Minister, Mr. Wang Yi, has indeed impressed the world with our ambition to utterly and completely lift all of the population of 1.4 billion out of poverty by the end of next year, 2020?
As always, he was disciplined. Yes, you can't deny China has made great progress in terms of poverty alleviation. However, there's still a very large number of people in deep poverty, and the gap between rich and poor is growing. Remember, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and a lot of them have to do with creating economic opportunities in poor areas, about improving education in poor areas, about helping women and reducing the gap between women and men. So while China has made demonstrable, significant gains, there still is much to be achieved in the next 13 years.
We need such honest advice from international observers. Let me cross over to the UK, where Isabel Hilton is standing by, and we expect her to make comments about feasibility of China's ambition to live up to the expectations of the not only Millennium Development Goal, but I'm talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. What do you think of the rest of the goals that China is supposed to meet?
Well, I think, you know, like the others, I would congratulate China on the poverty alleviation progress that it's made. It is very impressive. But I would also agree that there is a big problem of inequality. And I think that in terms of this particular summit, what was not in Wang Yi's speech, which I think the UN Secretary General was very much hoping for, was a firm commitment to more ambitious climate action. China is still very much in the Paris process, but 2020, next year, is a year that countries are expected to bring much more ambitious goals to the table in order to avoid 3 degrees of warming, which would be as catastrophic for China as anywhere else, and would undo many of the gains that have been made in poverty alleviation, because the poor will suffer first and hardest from climate change. So I think, you know, we were hoping that that China would give some indication of the commitment. Instead, there was a speech that, you know, congratulated China on the progress so far, which nobody quarrels with, but we're looking also for, you know, a sense of what happens next, particularly in this vital area.
Yes, indeed, you are building greater expectations like Charles Dickens did a couple of centuries back in his literature. Now, let me cross over to Mark Sleboda for his observation about what more could be done by China and other members of the international community to live up to the UN goal. Mark?
Yeah, with regards to these 17 sprawling, often conflicted UN development goals, they might be called 17 steps to utopia or 17 steps to nirvana. Whatever progress China has made will never be appreciated in the West. In fact, it will be, you know, this China as a more prosperous country providing a better standard of living for its people is instead viewed with no small amount of trepidation and fear in the West. And I think comments from our 2 previous Western commentators show that. I mean, representatives from the U.S. and the United Kingdom lecturing China that they need to do more to combat inequality is just a little bit too much hypocrisy for me to stomach. I'm sorry about that. This is the thing. Western, you know, geopoliticians and political foreign policy theorists looking at China and other countries like Russia have long assumed that if China and these other countries start to develop a middle class, that this middle class, in a kind of reversed Marxist theorizing, will start to think like Western middle classes, that they will identify them and push China to change its system and align with Western countries. And instead, the exact opposite has happened. Right? As Chinese citizens become more prosperous and middle class, they appreciate their own country and their own system, which was the exact opposite of the goal that Western countries have long talked about, with China increasing the standard of living for its people.
Thank you very much, Mark.
So
thank you so much.
Don't expect any applause from the West.
Thank you very much for the encouraging remarks and a very positive observation about what China has achieved, and, you know, mild criticism of the Western media. However, let me go back to 1984, when Ronald Reagan, late U.S. president, delivered a speech at the Fudan University. At the very beginning, he said, we learned the punchline from Confucius, running a big country is like cooking small fish. That has simplified, if not oversimplified, the adversity in running a big country of 1.4 billion. Ambassador Su, the next issue is very much about education opportunities. And education universally is accepted as a therapy for changing one's fate, for dramatically improving the quality of life and promoting and protecting dignity of individuals. So what do you think of the enormous efforts by the Chinese authorities to level the playing field so that the gap between rich and poor, urban and rural areas can be closed very quickly?
Okay, that's a very good question. As you all know that I was once ambassador to a small, beautiful country called Iceland. The population of that country is only 300,000. And our former premier was visiting that country. We happened to be in the same car. I asked him a question. What is the most, the biggest question in his mind? He said, well, jobs for the people. This year, he said, that was about 4 or 5 years ago. He said that year, China was going to have about 7 million college graduates. So education is a big thing in China. And also as for primary elementary education in the world, my figure is that 20% of the kids are out of school and they do not have anywhere to go. But China, we have the attendance for children to elementary schools is 100%. So that's a significant achievement. Of course, our international observers also say that in China, we have a long way to go. Yeah, for instance, for climate change, that's the topic of this year's UN General Assembly. Yes, you look at China, that's a vast expanse. We have enormous coal reserve. If you want to cut down emission, and then you need to use more natural gas. But how can we make sure that all the millions and even 1.4 billion people can have access to gas, whether there is enough or not? So we have to be very practical. So I think we are now doing, trying our very best to cut down the emission, to keep our promises. So we need everyone just to work together.
Yes, indeed, healthy and green development as well as a green economy remain a priority on the agenda of Mr. Xi Jinping. You also addressed the issue of 100% access to education for kids, be they in urban or rural areas. But what about those left behind in their millions? I mean, there are many articles in the West that pay particular attention to the poor kids. They may enjoy some degree of education. However, their parents are working and struggling to earn a decent living in urban areas without hukou to protect their dignity. So, Rick, did you notice this typically Chinese problem?
Well, I witnessed firsthand at Tsinghua University, and I teach some very smart students from all over China, and many of them come from rural areas. Many of them are the first in their families to attend college, and some of them have had parents who've moved from their hometowns in rural China to cities to earn a living so that they can support the family. So I really do appreciate the changes, and I appreciate the ability of people to move from poverty, from rural poverty, to the highest quality education, to success in 2 generations. It's just that China had so far to come from 1949 to 2019. And it's come so far when you talk about the number of people who have lifted themselves out of poverty. But still, that's the goal of the next 20 years, is to pull people who remain. And there are strategies for small towns as well as a macro strategy for dealing with it.
The issue of sustainability, is about the issue of sustainability is not only a major concern for the impoverished in rural areas, but perhaps more for the white deplorables in the Rust Belt, for the sinking middle class in developed countries. It's about what does it mean for all member states of the UN to fix the problem of middle class concerns. I mean, most of them complain their income remain much the same, if not has sunk a little bit further. What do you think of the grievances of this large group of the society in developed countries?
Well, I think it's pretty dangerous. Once the middle classes begin to feel aggrieved, then quite unpleasant political developments can result. But I think there are 2 problems here. And one of them is the deindustrialization and the fact that, you know, China became the world's factory, and that meant that populations in more developed countries found themselves concerned about their living. And the problem there was really that their home governments made so little provision for that transition. Because, you know, it's perfectly normal part of globalization that production goes and moves around the world, and that was envisaged. But what was not provided for was the transition that the people who lost those jobs would have to make to a different form of employment and to have a different future. And that is very concerning. I think that on the sustainability front, it's going to be true for every economy that we are going to have to make a very important transition to a cleaner, greener, more efficient form of production, and China itself is facing this. You know, Xi Jinping's whole program is an attempt to address this very, very difficult moment when China has to move away from the model that has delivered success so far, but which is now exhausted, and make a very complicated transition to a greener and more efficient economy. But if China doesn't do that, and if other countries don't do that, then none of this progress is going to be sustainable. That's the message that Xi Jinping has understood. I was rather hoping he might persuade Donald Trump that that was the message that Donald Trump should understand too. So maybe the next time they meet, he can work on that.
Well, President Trump, you said to be closing one of his eyes and open the other. I'm not sure, but let me cross over to Mark. A special workshop has been set up by some of the policymakers in the West to address religious issues, and it's called the Global Call, where China came under criticism, and Vice President Mike Pence pinpointed Xinjiang, which is also known for the rest of the world as being new frontier for the alleged violation of human rights. What do you think of, say, this sensitive issue, not only for China, but in the wake of the Cold War, religious extremism and the radicalization of the dangerous ideologies have started to characterize the uncertainty and unpredictability in some parts of the world. I believe Chechnya in Russia should also be viewed as a flashpoint in this general picture. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, so this climate summit really was not Donald Trump's speed, and so that's why he essentially skipped the climate summit except for a 10-minute walk-in, and has arranged this meeting on religious freedom, which is primarily, let's face it, when it's coming from the likes of Donald Trump, is a weaponized forum to attack Chinese policies in Xinjiang. Now, the problem that China is facing in their far west is not dissimilar from problems that Russia has faced, particularly 15, 20 years ago in Chechnya. That is also a problem in Syria and other areas. And the problem of religious extremism and this connection between religious extremism of a particular sort with terrorism can be really narrowed down in 95% of the cases to one word. It's a word, however, that cannot be uttered in the halls of Washington, D.C. because of its close alliance with the terror-spawning Saudi dictatorship. And that word is Wahhabism.
Wahhabism
is
indeed the hotbed for the rise of religious extremism
facing.
In the wake of the Cold War, and the Taliban, Al-Qaeda are said to be thriving on the ideology of Wahhabism that basically comes from the Middle East. Let me come back to ask Ambassador Su Ge, what do you think of the progress that the Chinese government has been so proud of in improving livelihoods of Uyghurs and Han people in Xinjiang?
Well, maybe people could read some criticism of what's going on in Xinjiang. But if you ask those people, have you been to Xinjiang? And most people have not. I have colleagues who have just been there to some schools. Actually, locally they call it job training or vocational schools. In some Western media, is called like a concentration camp or anything. Because just now you mentioned education. Actually, education is one of the best means not only to elevate poverty, but eradicate the soil for radical, for extremism. Because in an area where people do not have adequate education, then they have lost hopes. Then it will be easy for them to be taken by some radical ideas. So in Xinjiang, for instance, the people, they learn basic job skills, for instance, computers, bulldozers, how to drive tractors, how to communicate, how to write, to fill out papers. Well, I would say that if you ask those people to go to Xinjiang, and they all and seeing is believing, and also people talk about the freedom of religion, and my figure is that in China there are 20 million Muslims. In Xinjiang, for every 450 people there is a mosque. So how can you say that? So it's actually basic. It's very convenient for people to go to mosque.
Among all the labor skills that are so important, basic for finding a job and creating wealth for the family in an honest manner, the command of Mandarin is first and foremost the most important labor skill for the Uyghurs. I was told, because I visited Xinjiang twice in the past month, and I was impressed by the training for the command of language skills. Rick looks very serious. Are you reflecting upon Xinjiang, or are you thinking about the start of the impeachment process against President Donald Trump by Nancy Pelosi, or both?
They're both serious topics.
Yes, very serious topic.
I don't think the coverage of Xinjiang in global media is completely unfair, and I do think that it's something that needs to be talked about fully. But let's talk about Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi. I mean, that's serious for him. It's a turning point. Nancy Pelosi had resisted having impeachment proceedings begin, but Donald Trump, having cut off aid to Ukraine a week before he talked to the new president of Ukraine, and then having in a discussion that he may want to talk to Donald Trump's personal lawyer about corruption involving Joe Biden's son, is a serious issue, because that is the kind of issue that unites the Democrats who have been divided on impeachment, and it will make it difficult for Donald Trump to pursue his legislative agenda and his global political agenda in the months to come.
Isabel, are you surprised by the performance of President Donald Trump on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly? Obviously, Mr. Donald Trump is looking for victories, wins, and positive achievements to justify the presidency in the first 3 years. Do you think what he has done will play out?
I wish I could say I was surprised, but I think it's pretty much what we've come to expect. And I think to get all this into perspective, it's useful to remember that the day after Donald Trump won the presidency in 2016, he registered his campaign for 2020. He's never done terribly well in the popular vote, even in 2016. His ratings have not been good. So everything that he is now doing is really campaigning, including the religious meeting the religious freedom meeting that you talked about. If you looked at the back 3 rows of that meeting, it was described by The Guardian in London as a summit of one, because no leaders went except the UN Secretary General, who was obliged to attend. But the last 3 rows were tickets given out to American religious groups. Because that is a sector that Donald Trump is going to need to mobilize if he is going to stand a chance in 2020. And the question of Ukraine and Biden falls into the same category. So I think we just need to read all of this now in terms of the 2020 election. Who knows? I would be pretty disappointed if the American public had not seen through Donald Trump by 2020, but, you know, democracy is democracy, and at least we can be reassured that after his second term, that'll be it. He won't be president for life, whatever happens in 2020. It would be quite nice if he was no longer president in 2020, of course.
Mark, everybody is talking about ramifications and influence of the upcoming general election in the United States. Last time, President Putin and Russia were accused of meddling with the U.S. Domestic campaign. What about the next one? Do you think it is unfair or the other way around? The rest of the world is being held hostage by the political agenda of Republicans and Democrats in the D.C. What is your major concern at this defining moment of American domestic politics?
Yeah, I think my primary concern is how certain American political elites, and we're talking about an America that American scholars at Carnegie Mellon have identified is the #1 culprit in the world at meddling in other countries' domestic political affairs and elections. How certain factions of the American political elite, in order to deny agency to members, portions of their own population that they disagree with, have to look for outside enemies, right, and opinions expressed on social media platforms as the justification. So the U.S. dragging their domestic political, squabbling and dragging other countries in the world into it, I think, is a real problem. And the new comedian turned president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, certainly finds himself in that situation right now. But Donald Trump is facing a real challenge now. And there's no question that Joe Biden, in the aftermath of the U.S.-backed overthrow of the democratically elected Ukrainian government when he was acting as pro-consul, his son there, there's such an ethical breach and so much corruption going on with Burisma Holdings there that it really warrants an investigation. But it, of course, doesn't justify the way Donald Trump went about it. And Donald Trump is in real trouble right now because there's no question that Nancy Pelosi can pull the House. But Donald Trump is also in danger in the Senate because the Republican Party political elite have never liked Donald Trump.
But I'm afraid other than Fox News, all other news channels will be viewed as fake news by the President of the White House. Before we conclude the very interesting discussion here, Ambassador Su, what do you make of the keynote presentation that State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi delivered on other occasions? For example, U.S.-China Business Council as well as Council of Foreign Relations. He talked to a big crowd of American businessmen, the business community, as well as policymakers who are really concerned about the future of U.S.-China relationship.
Yeah, against the background of this time of changing world situation, I think the State Councilor Minister Wang Yi is making a very important speech on U.S.-China relations. And he starts by listing all 4 aspects of U.S.-China relations. Basically, he was saying that we have complementary economies, and we are not enemies, and so on. And we have very important relationship. You can actually benefit both. You cannot say that one has ripped off the other and so on. But the conclusion has 3 ingredients. Number 1 is that in areas we can cooperate. Let's cooperate. And areas where we have very big problems, and we try to manage those problems. And then, as for certain areas, we have to live with each other.
Right. Exactly the point, that neither could replace the other in what is called a zero-sum game. It's a win-win, hopefully, for China and the majority of the business community on both sides. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.